if I have someone that buys 10 times a year, but they buy from my brand 100% of the time, and I have
Mm.
someone else that buys 1,000 times a year, and they buy from my brand only 10% of the time. I have a customer that does 10 purchases and a customer that does 100 purchases. The customer with 10 purchases is significantly more loyal than the customer that does 10 purchases. And because they're more loyal, if I'm already getting 100% of their purchases, I'm not going to get 110%. There's no place to go there.
Welcome to Table Stakes, where we dive deep into the conversations that matter most in customer experience. I'm Michel Stevens, and today we're about to challenge one of the most fundamental beliefs in our industry. Customer loyalty is something that you can build, measure, and rely on. Here's a question that might make you uncomfortable. What if everything you've been told about customer loyalty is wrong? What if those loyalty programs, those NPS scores, those retention strategies you've been investing are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how markets actually work? Today, we're joined by Dale Harrison, a researcher and strategist who spent years studying what he calls the loyalty myth. Dale will introduce us to something called double jeopardy, a market law. I'm not going to spoil everything for you there, but if he's right, it means that we need to completely rethink how we approach customer experience strategies. Fair warning, this conversation might challenge you some deeply held beliefs, but sometimes the most valuable insights come from being willing to question what we think we know. Oh, Dale, welcome to Table Stakes.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so am I. I've been looking forward to this one, really. When it was in books, I was like, well, Dale is coming to the show. Yeah, really happy that you're here. Now, before we dive into what might be some controversial territory, tell us about your journey. What led you to question one of the most sacred concepts in customer experience and marketing, namely customer loyalty?
I mean, some of it is just, trying to, work around improving loyalty. And a lot of that is also working around the inverse of loyalty, which is churn, because the two are really exactly the same thing. They're just the flip side of the coin. So, I've been involved in doing churn analysis and working on programs to try to change churn rates since since the late 1990s, and across multiple different industries. And one of the things that you see is that, and again, if you think about churn as kind of something that's a bit easier to get your hands on because you can directly see kind of the disloyalty, the rate at which they're staying or leaving. And one of the things that you see is there is a wide range of loyalty. There are people who stay with you for a very long period, people who churn very rapidly, and then a lot of people in between. And then the question is, what can we as marketers do to alter long-term churn behavior? The answer is basically nothing. That you can very effectively manage very short-term churn behavior during that first 30 to 90-day onboarding period. But once you get past that, so basically, early on, they're not necessarily that committed to the product. And so it becomes easy to get frustrated and leave. So there's a lot that you can do to keep people engaged, as they're going through that process of using the product and interacting with it and engaging with it. Once you hit that initial kind of onboarding period, there's nothing that you as a marketer can do that will have any meaningful effect on long-term churn rates. And you see the flip side of this when you also look at loyalty programs. Now, the thing with churn is these are usually subscription-based products. A lot of the language around loyalty is around what I call repertoire-based products, meaning products that you are buying on a periodic basis. So, you go to the store and you buy a box of laundry detergent, and you might buy Tide, or you might buy Gain, or you might buy Arm & Hammer. And you might buy something different each time. In fact, almost everyone does. They have some group of brands that they'll buy from. And, so there, loyalty is usually the terminology rather than churn. And people are constantly talking about how do we get more, how do we make the customers more loyal? How do we get more loyal customers? And and that leads very directly into a couple of questions that I don't think anyone in the loyalty world tends to ever ask. So, you know, if someone says we need more loyalty, that the mere fact that you're making that statement implies that there is some difference in loyalty between some customers versus other customers. So there should be like some customers who are very loyal, some who have very low loyalty, and there has to be something in between. So there has to be some customers that have kind of middle level of loyalty. And presumably you want less of those disloyal customers and more of those loyal customers. So, but the mere fact that you make the statement that we want more loyal customers, that automatically implies that there is some sort of frequency distribution of loyalty. So some percentage of customers are very loyal, some percentage are very, have low levels of loyalty, and then there's some other percentage in the middle. So we would expect some kind of a curve, a loyalty curve. And so if we're going to run a loyalty program, what we're not looking for is 3 customers who buy more. What we're looking at is fundamentally altering the shape of that loyalty curve, because you can have tweak around the edges and have anecdotes to show. But what you really want to say is there some way that we can substantially increase the volume of revenue from the existing base of customers? And the way to do that is you get more customers who buy more from you and fewer customers who buy less from you, or customers who buy more frequently versus less frequently from you. And but this entire thing implies that there's some kind of a curve that defines what fraction of your customers are relatively low levels of loyalty, relatively high levels, and then in between. And it turns out you can actually calculate what that curve looks like.
Oh yeah.
And which again, you never see this in the loyalty world. And so the key question then becomes, if you want to claim that your loyalty program is working, you should be able to map that curve before the loyalty program, then map the curve afterwards and see substantial differences. So this becomes an absolute rock solid mechanism for determining whether or not a loyalty program is actually working.
So what you're saying is that you have a traditional bell curve, I assume.
It's sort of bell shaped, but and we can talk about that in a minute. But it's a curve that's
Yeah, but it needs to be skewed, right?
Yeah. So most of your customers are kind of in the middle, and then as you go toward more and more loyal customers, there are fewer and fewer. And as you go to less and less loyal customers, there are fewer and fewer. So it is sort of roughly a bell-shaped curve.
Right. But okay, so I have to ask, because when you first started talking about this loyalty myth, what kind of reactions did you get from others? I mean, I can imagine that this wasn't always a very popular message.
Oh, no, it still
right?
isn't. I mean, a lot of confused responses, and a lot of it goes back to, I have yet to find a single supposed loyalty expert who can give me a precise definition of what loyalty is. And I always ask the question. And what I get back is just this sort of brain mush word salad of brand love and emotional commitment and attitudinal behavioral changes. None of this tells me, just give me the simple definition. If I have 2 customers and one of them is more loyal than the other customer, tell me how those 2 customers are different. Simple question. And it turns out that there's a very simple answer. And this answer has been around for 70 or 80 years. And it's called share of category requirements. And it basically...
That's completely Japanese for me.
I know.
Sorry.
No one in the loyalty world has, almost none of them, occasionally you'll run across someone, but almost no one has ever heard the word. And the term is very simple. For me as an individual, of all of the times I purchase in the category, what fraction of my purchases do I give to this particular brand? So if 90% of the time that I buy laundry detergent, I buy Tide, my share of category requirements is 0.9 or 90%. Very simple. And so now if you've got two customers and this customer is more loyal than that customer, it's easy to know whether or not that's a true statement. You simply measure the fraction of their total purchases that go to your brand versus the other customer's total purchases. So for instance, one of the things that often gets people confused is this notion that it's not how often someone buys your brand. Because if I have someone that buys 10 times a year, but they buy from my brand 100% of the time, and I have someone else that buys 1,000 times a year and they buy from my brand only 10% of the time, I have a customer that does 10 purchases and a customer does 100 purchases. But the customer with 10 purchases is significantly more loyal than the customer that does 10 purchases. And because they're more loyal, if I'm already getting 100% of their purchases, I'm not going to get 110%.
Yeah, no,
So if we're going to
makes
make a
sense.
change, if we're going to change the loyalty of our customer base, we're not going to make the highly loyal customers more loyal. There's no place to go there. We need to make the less loyal customers more loyal, which means we need those less loyal customers to buy from us more frequently than they're buying from other people, for whatever level of purchases they're doing, within a time period.
Yeah.
And that's this notion of share of category requirements. There's kind of a corrupted version of this that people refer to as share of wallet.
I was thinking of that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So share of wallet has a hidden assumption baked into it. So share of wallet assumes that the average purchase basket size is fixed, meaning most people that go to the store to buy a box of laundry detergent will on average buy one box. So, you don't have an example, there's no examples in the real world where some shoppers are leaving that store with one box of laundry detergent in their cart and other shoppers are leaving the store with 50,000 boxes of laundry detergent in their cart. So share of wallet is basically looking at how do you split out the dollar value of the purchases. That works if you're looking at things like FMCG goods, so like basic consumer product goods, because typically the purchase size is a function of household size. And, in the US, the average household size is 2.5 with like 1.3 plus or minus variance. So it means that almost every household is nearly identical in size. So you're not going to have one household consuming, one box of Tide a month and another household consuming 10,000 boxes a month. And so if you're dealing with FMCG type consumer goods, then share of wallet and share of category requirements are essentially the same. But if you look at, say, Microsoft Office, Microsoft's largest customers buy several 100,000 licenses of Office. Their smallest customers buy one license. So there you've got, more than a six-fold spread in purchase value for exactly the same product. And, so that's why you have to be careful about share of wallet versus the share of category requirements, because with loyalty, what we really are worried about is trying to get individual decision-making processes to shift. So we want more people to decide to buy our brand than the other guy's brand. Or to buy our brand more frequently than they buy the other guy's brand. So that's why what matters is looking at purchase occasions, because those are the decision points. Again, if I'm Exxon and I'm buying Microsoft Office, I can decide, to buy Microsoft Office or, Open Office.
Open Office, yeah.
But I cannot decide that I'm only going to buy one copy. So the fact that I'm going to buy 150,000 copies is baked into who I am as the buyer. But the decision to choose brand A versus brand B, that's a decision that I can control. So again, as brands, what we want to think about is, can we manipulate the decision-making that the buyer has control over? And this is this idea of how frequently do I choose one brand over another brand, when I buy in that category.
Right. I already have the feeling that we're going down. Well, I feel that we're going down a rabbit hole already. Maybe we should rewind a little bit and start with the foundation of things. For me, the distinction between a share of wallet and what was it again?
Share of category requirements.
There you go.
So
I really have to
SCR
study
is the acronym.
CR. Right. So that is for me. That's for me. For me, that's new because I never actually considered it something like that before. For me, it was always share of wallet and period. But let's start with the foundation. Most of our listeners have probably never heard of double jeopardy in a business context. Can you explain this concept in simple terms for our audience? What does that mean? Uh,
So
Double jeopardy. I mean,
this is a buying pattern that seems to be absolutely universal across all products. It was first discovered in the mid 1950s, actually, by some of the very, very earliest work around TV advertisement. And they were looking at they were basically looking at um, how different TV stations and TV networks bought advertising, and there were certain patterns that fell out. There was one of the big ad agencies in the 50s that first saw this. It was formalized by a guy named William McPhee, who was a social scientist in the very early 1960s, and then in the late 60s, Andrew Ehrenberg applied all of the mathematics around it to brand selection for consumer goods. So this is a very, very, this is a 70-year-old concept. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of studies that show that every single product category and every brand follows this double jeopardy rule. And basically what the rule says is that the difference between a large brand and a small brand, and when we say large and small, what we mean is two competing brands that have different levels of market share. So let's say we've got a brand with 50% market share and a brand with 2% market share. How are these brands different? And they're different in two ways. The large brand has more customers, which seems like an obvious thing. And it has slightly, and their customers are slightly, when I say slightly, I mean very slightly, more loyal than the customers of the small brand. Has nothing to do with the brand. It has nothing to do with marketing. This is purely a mathematical artifact driven by a couple of deeper patterns in purchasing. So one of these patterns is this idea that individual buyers tend to have a relatively stable cadence of buying. So, if I'm if I'm a single student living in a dorm, I might buy a box of laundry detergent every 2 months. And I'm going to keep buying it every 2 months for typically not my entire life, but for a relatively long period of time, because my circumstances aren't going to change. If I'm a family of 7, I'm probably buying a box every week, and I'm going to keep buying a box every week indefinitely. And so the idea is that in any given category, a buyer has a relatively stable purchase frequency, and that purchase frequency tends to remain the same over long periods of time, but that the frequency will be different for different buyers. And so if you kind of add up all of the individual buyers out there, some people buying once a week, some once a month, once every 2 months, you add all of this up and you can get this sort of distribution of how many buyers are buying at what, on what cadence. And that distribution is called a negative binomial distribution. It's a probability distribution that basically is, some people refer to it as the banana curve because it's sort of shaped like a banana typically. And the idea is that you tend to have relatively few very heavy buyers and a lot of relatively few high frequency buyers and a very large group of relatively low frequency buyers. And you see this with something like Coke. There is a small fraction of the market that will will consume multiple Cokes a day. But there's a much, much larger part of the market that will only buy a Coke once every 6 months, once a year, once every 18 months. So there's this huge body of infrequent buyers. And it turns out that about half of Coke's purchases are done by people who are buying once a year or less. And so this pattern shows up over and over again in different, in different product categories is that, especially if you have a consumer good with a very large market, there's just an enormous number of people that will occasionally pick up a Coke, even though they don't typically drink it.
Yeah.
And then there's a relatively small number that are really intensive buyers that, they're drinking, a 6-pack a day. And you see this in alcohol, you see this in laundry detergent, you see this in milk, you see this even in things like cars buying,
Mm.
or so if you've ever dealt with a dealership, there are people who will trade their car in every 2 years. There are people who will trade their car in every 4 years when the warranty runs out. Just, you can expect them to show up. But then there are people who you won't see them for 10 years. And in
Right.
fact, the average duration for holding on to a car in the US is 7 to 10 years. But you've got this cohort of buyers that will buy, every 1 year, every 2 years, but they're small. So that's this idea of purchase frequency. Then the other thing is that each individual buyer has a fixed set of brand preferences. These brand preferences can shift slowly over time, but for kind of short to midterm periods, if you normally buy Tide, but sometimes you buy Gain, this is the pattern. And, you may occasionally try a third brand or even a fourth brand, but that sort of pattern of brand choices tends to be relatively sticky for individuals. We tend to be very habitual in our brand choice
Yeah.
behavior, and especially if we're buying the products on a relatively frequent basis. But the deal is that different buyers will have different brand choices. And so again, if you take sort of all of your buyers and you add them up in terms of how many people are buying brand A, how many brand B, or how many purchase occasions or does brand A get selected? How many purchase occasions does brand B get selected? Because what you see is individual buyers will cycle between different brands, even if they have a strong preference for one. And again, this is another, so you have this distribution of different numbers of people are buying, making different brand choices at each purchase occasion. And this is called a Dirichlet distribution. And if you put these together, you have this model called the NBD-Dirichlet model that says the pace at which individual buyers are purchasing and their brand choices, when you multiply them together, what you get is the relative market share between competing brands in a category. Yeah,
Right.
and one of the things that we know is that market share tends to be extremely stable. Brands do not grow by taking market share. When market share does change, it typically takes years or decades to see any substantial change in market share. So relative share within a market tends to be just extremely fixed. And one example is, going back to laundry detergent. Tide is the number one brand in the US. It has 40% market share. It
Mm.
was the number one brand in 1946,
Was it?
uh, and has never been toppled. Um, you
Okay.
know, Colgate was the number one brand of toothpaste in 1897.
Okay.
And it remained number one until 1962 when Crest introduced fluoride. And
Right.
Crest held the number one position. And then so Colgate went to number two. Crest became number one because Crest was number two before. Crest was number one from 62 to 1997. And from 1997 to 2025, Colgate has been the number one brand. So that gives you a sense of just how astonishingly stable market share, relative market share tends to be within categories.
Well, okay. Now my mind starts to work, right? And I mean, this is truly fascinating. I think we can go on for about an hour or two, but I can already hear our listeners think, okay, but if this is true, what does that mean for everything I've been working on in the last 10
Well,
years maybe, or maybe even longer?
so here's the problem. If you and what let's go back to double jeopardy for just a second. So what double jeopardy says is it's basically taking these two facts that we know, that purchase frequency is very stable for individual buyers, and that brand choice tends to be very stable for individual buyers, and that the two of these, we know they're stable because we can look at market share, and that's stable. So, so that gives us a couple of levers we can pull as marketers. One is, can we get someone to buy the product more often? I mean, just not necessarily from us, just in general. And the answer to that is absolutely no. And so
Darn.
for instance, if I'm buying one box of laundry detergent a month, there's nothing you're going to do with advertising or marketing that's going to convince me to buy 10 boxes a month. Am I going to start washing all my shirts 10 times between wearing so I can use up all this extra laundry detergent you convinced me to buy? No. So the rate at which we buy products is driven by this sort of periodic emergence of needs that marketers have absolutely no control over. So we're not going to be able to get people to buy, that we're buying one box a month to start buying 10 boxes of detergent a month. That's not going to happen. So the other lever we can pull is we can get them to buy our brand more often, which then goes to the very heart of this idea of share of category requirements. Can I get more people to buy, can I get people who buy my brand 10% of the time to now buy it 20% of the time? And so any sort of marketing program that's going to work, sort of loyalty program that's going to work, has to be able to basically pull that lever. And you're going to be able to see the effect of that in taking market share, because you cannot get more people to buy your brand. If purchase frequency is fixed, and the only other lever that we can pull is they choose us more often. You cannot get people to choose you more often without seeing substantial changes in your market share. If your loyalty program is working, you should see significant changes in market share from year to year. And the fact is, we never, ever see that. It is changes in market share. And there's a great research paper from just 4 or 5 years ago that was done by Aaron Bass, where they looked at almost 700 brands across 30 categories. And they followed these brands for 5 years. And the average change in market share for the entire 5-year period was 0.01%.
Okay, that's quite painful.
So what that says is that the only way you're going to increase loyalty is to increase the overall share of category requirements, meaning get people to buy you more often than buying someone else compared to what they used to do, which means that you will directly see that in significant changes in your market share. So you should be able to measure that. When we actually go out and measure it across hundreds and hundreds of brands across dozens of product categories, we see nothing. We see completely stable market share, which is a very strong indication that loyalty is a very difficult thing to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. One of the things that you said before we talked, you said something like persistent high levels of customer loyalty cannot happen in a stable market. That challenges pretty much everything I've been taught about, loyalty as well.
So if we start with a kind of a very simple idea, and again, this is a very, very old idea. This goes back into the early to mid 1960s when this pattern was first seen. But there's this idea of a correlation between share of voice, in the market and share of market. And what you see is that if a brand increases its share of voice, it will increase its market share. If it decreases its share of voice, its market share will go down. And you see this go in both directions. So you see examples of companies that are aggressively gaining market share because they have, someone dropped $500 million on them. And then so they've got massive amounts of cash above above the cash that's being generated just from selling their product. They can now pour into marketing. And so, all of the VC-backed tech companies, they are successfully taking market share, but they're doing it because they are pouring vastly more sums of money into marketing than they would otherwise be able to based on their cash flow. And you see the same thing go in the other direction. There are, again, a number of very interesting studies looking at brands that have chosen to either quit marketing or to substantially reduce marketing. And what you see is market share immediately starts to take a drop. And, within a year or two, you see significant double-digit drop in market share. And so there's this equilibrium between share of voice and market share. And, and again, share of voice is just basically how much reach do we have? How much money can we spend to get our message in front of potential buyers? And so the problem here is, let's imagine you've got a market with a small brand with, say, so they've got, 10% market share.
Mm.
And in the market, there is a small cohort of customers that, for whatever reason, love that brand. And so let's say that there are 10% of all buyers are going to buy that brand 100% of the time. So,
Hmm.
and again, this is kind of matching the classic loyalty argument. We just need this one group of buyers that have our loyalty card to just buy from us all the time and no one else. So one of the things that happens is that brand will now have more revenue than they should have based on their market share. Because normally those buyers are going to split their purchases between your brand and the other brands. But because your loyalty program has convinced them to spend all their money with you, then you get this excess amount of revenue that you would not have otherwise gotten based on your market share.
Hmm.
Because all those dollars that should be going to, normally should be sort of randomly distributed to other brands, are all going to you. So now you've got a permanent structural excess level of revenue above your level of market share. If you take that revenue and you pour that back into more marketing, you now have a permanent structural excess share of voice that doesn't require any outside capital. So you can, you now have cash from this loyal cohort of customers that you shouldn't normally have if it was sort of a more typical sort of market structure. And by pouring that cash back into marketing, you can set up the conditions for a permanent structural excess share of voice, which means that you will permanently be able to keep taking market share until you have 100% market share. And so this is the problem with even fairly, and I have, I've built and run simulations looking at how rapidly this can happen. And and so one simulation I had was a company where there's two brands. One brand had 80% market share, one had 20%. It was 10% of the underlying customer base that was, suddenly 100% loyal to the 20% market share brand. Within 5 years, that 20% market share brand will have 100% market share, just because of the excess share of voice, where they're pouring,
Yeah.
the additional revenue back into more marketing. And what happens is that, if you actually could have a stable, permanent cohort of highly loyal customers, it injects market instabilities that leads to full market collapse. And we never see this in the real world. And what actually happens is that you get what's called competitor damping effects. So let's think about how you could build a super loyal cohort. Let's
Mm.
say you've got a purchase card where if you have this purchase card, we will knock 90% off of our price. That'll get people loyal. Doesn't do much for the business, but you get a lot of loyal customers. What's going to happen is your competitors are going to match that price some way. They'll have their own, and you see this in like supermarket loyalty cards. Every freaking supermarket has a loyalty card. And
Mm.
so whatever gain one supermarket chain has with a loyalty card, it's being offset because every other supermarket chain has their own loyalty card that's essentially identical. You see this with airlines. There's no freaking difference between the the miles program on Delta versus United versus, JetBlue versus any of the others. They all are calibrated to have a nearly identical economic value. And so this is one way that you see, because loyalty programs are trivially easy to counter by competitors. So, one is based on, an economic loyalty program.
Mm.
Another way that you can get a highly loyal cohort is, and this is an example I often use. Let's say we're looking at a category of companies that sell tools to plumbers. And so everybody sells right-handed wrenches for plumbers. And that's great for 90% of the market, but 10% of plumbers are left-handed. And so now we have this new small brand, and they have ambidextrous wrenches that work equally well for right-handed or left-handed. So those ambidextrous wrenches are not going to have any special appeal to the 90% of right-handers, but
Mm.
it'll be really appealing to the 10% of left-handers. And so, what you're going to see is through that product differentiation, you can establish a highly loyal cohort, within the overall market. But what are your competitors going to do when they see you do this? They're all going to immediately make slight design changes to their wrenches so that everyone will be offering ambidextrous wrenches as well. And so you
Right.
might get a brief period where your product differentiation can help you, build a temporarily loyal cohort, which you could use during that period to actually take a little bit of market share. But that differentiation is going to be wiped out very soon. And a good example of this is Salesforce. So when Salesforce launched in 9, they were the only CRM product that was in the cloud. Now, it turns out in 9, everybody was used to what's called on-prem software, meaning that you load the software, you buy the software, you load it on your own servers, and you manage it yourself with internal staff. There was a small cohort of buyers that were basically small to mid-sized businesses with understaffed IT departments. And one of the things that was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s was that these companies with understaffed IT departments were struggling because more and more software was being used, and they didn't have the staff to keep provisioning new servers and loading and managing new server software. And so, it was tough to get, if you were a sales manager at a $20 million company with a, too small of an IT department, you might wait 6, 9, 12 months to get scheduled in to have your CRM package installed. Day one market proposition was, you don't even have to tell IT you're doing this, Mr. VP of sales. Just swipe your credit card and a full-blown CRM will just magically show up in everyone's browser, and no one needs to know the better. And so this was an extremely compelling proposition, an extremely compelling point of differentiation. And it helped Salesforce rapidly take market share in the early 2000s. Now, the other thing that also helped was that the Siebel, which was the company that had probably 80% market share by the late 80s, had decided to basically pour gasoline over themselves and set
Yeah.
themselves on fire. So, so that helped as well. But what you saw was that by roughly 2010, about 12 years in, after Salesforce began work on their product, 100% of all CRM providers either was purely in the cloud or they had a cloud offering. And so that single point of differentiation was no longer meaningful by 2010. And what you saw was that Salesforce completely flipped their marketing and their branding around 2010, because this is when you saw them drop the no software logo.
Yeah.
This is when you saw them bring Astro in as their mascot and then add his friends. By 2010 to 2012, Salesforce completely quit even mentioning the fact they were in the cloud because it was a meaningless
Mm.
feature. And so, the things that you can do to create a highly loyal cohort of buyers, basically fall into either give them an economic incentive, or, give them something about the product that is uniquely valuable to some subset of your buyers so that they will heavily gravitate towards you. And both of these are trivially easy to match by your competitors, which is why you might can get a brief momentary advantage, but you're not going to get permanent advantage. And, another sort of interesting variant of this is running sales. Everybody runs sales on Black Friday. One of the things that we've seen is that you can, if you lower the price dramatically, you will increase demand for the product. As soon as you raise the price again, the market goes right back to where it was before. You don't change any brand loyalties. They bought you because you were cheap, and it was on the shelf. Um, you don't alter brand loyalties. You don't alter any kind of brand preference or brand choice, and you don't permanently alter demand, because as soon as the price goes up, demand drops back down again, and the original kind of long-term brand preference brand preferences that individual buyers have return. And so, that's kind of a very compressed version of what a lot of loyalty card programs are
Mm.
trying to do, because they're essentially offering an economic incentive. And, what you see, another example is the airlines, that the average American does one medium range air flight a year.
Mm.
And, so, something that would be, less than half a cross continent flight. The loyalty, miles programs, the loyalty programs that all the airlines use, which are in miles, the average economic value of that average trip is roughly $1.20.
Okay.
Uh, so only people who are going to have recognize any significant economic value from a miles program is someone who is traveling heavily. You know,
Yeah.
because you have people who who will do 40 or 50 trips a year, and those are the people who are using the loyalty programs, which is a very tiny fraction of your customers. Because again, you think about the average is one trip a year. That means half the population does less than one mid mid duration air trip per year on a commercial flight. And there's simply not enough economic value in any of these loyalty programs to influence the purchase of anyone other than the very, very heaviest buyers.
Yeah, that is something that we see here in Europe as well. There was a study done by Professor Jorna Lane here, who monitored supermarkets, consumers, and their supermarket behavior, spending behavior, for over a year. And what she did with her team was to look at the difference between people who were in a loyalty program and people who weren't. Now, there was a large difference between in spending from the people who were in a loyalty program and the people who weren't. At some point, there was 30% difference. But then she went into the data, and actually, what turned out was that they were actually in the loyalty program because they were heavy buyers already, and that's why there was such a difference between the value of people in the loyalty program and people who were not in loyalty programs. Very often these loyalty programs, yeah, they skew themselves as well.
Well, and this is the problem, that the most idiotic measurement that anyone can possibly do in marketing is to compare the purchase volume of people who are in loyalty programs to the purchase volume of people who are not. Because the problem there is that, again, if you look at flyers, if I'm flying once a year, and my points are worth, have an economic value of slightly more than $1, I am not going to be very devoted to to your miles program, your points program. If I'm doing 40 flights a year, you better believe I'm going to sign up for it because it's a freebie. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't have been flying anyway. I'm already a frequent user. So, so again, what you're going to see if you looked at airline, people who use airline miles, the people who use them the most heavily are the ones who were most likely to fly anyway. And you've actually seen some studies with this with airlines, because a lot of airline choice depends on the hub structure. So for instance, I'm in Houston. I tend to heavily fly Delta because I'm usually flying to the East Coast. I can hub through Atlanta, or if I'm going to the West Coast, I hub through Salt Lake City. And Delta allows me to have the fewest number of stops. So so I have a high likelihood I'm going to use Delta anyway, simply because it's the most convenient in terms of I want to optimize for the fewest number of plane changes on a long trip.
Yeah, yeah,
And
Max.
and I'm a Delta flight miles user.
Yeah, yeah.
But
That makes total sense, right?
so uh you know but it's not Delta's reward program that convinced me to choose Delta. And I also fly on United occasionally, and their awards program is absolutely identical.
Yeah,
So there's no advantage to choosing one airline over the other airline purely for the awards program. Um, And especially if I'm if I'm an average consumer of airline travel.
Yeah. Dale, so if I'm trying to wrap my head around this, so if loyalty is largely a myth, this raises a crucial question. What should a CX professional actually be focusing on? I mean, if you were advising a CX leader or a marketing leader who's been told to increase customer loyalty, what would you tell them? How would you have that kind of conversation? Because the CEO has been always been told that, yeah, this is something that you need to push, right? You need to push for loyalty. So that's a very
But
difficult conversation to have,
but
right?
but the thing that I've seen is I think that there's sort of a corruption in the industry because people expect you to magically produce more loyal customers. There's kind of a relatively small number of tools that you can, that are sort of standard in the industry. And then if you look at the measurement process around these tools, the measurement processes are utterly corrupted. They are engineered to always show that it works, whether it does or not. So the classic one that you see 90% of the time is the loyalty program customers spend 3 times as much per year as the people who are not in our program. Again, we know that says nothing other than, the people who have the greatest economic benefit by you giving them a discount will take the discount. And, the other one of the other things that you see is the use of what's called synthetic controls, where they will say, we'll look at the demographics of people in the loyalty program, and then we will find a matching group that isn't in the loyalty program and look at their demographics. And again, the assumption here is that there's something in demographics that will define either your purchase frequency or your brand preferences. And we know that's that brand preferences are essentially not correlated with demographic data. And so you're basically inventing a control group that superficially sounds like it would work without really digging into the assumption behind how you chose the control group. Because the assumption is that, if I'm a white male between 35 and 42, I will buy, I will buy 1.2 boxes of laundry detergent a month. Well, that's simply not true.
Hmm.
That I could have a huge range and still be in that demographic. And so you can't use, 2 different demographically equivalent cohorts and compare their purchase patterns and use that as an explanation for why your loyalty program is working. And so there's a number of these approaches to measurement that are just utterly flawed. And and what's interesting is they're always flawed in exactly the same direction. They're always structurally engineered so that they will give you an incorrect answer, always in the direction of proving that that the loyalty program is working. And if you go back to and this is the other thing, is this the entire loyalty industry just rigorously avoids answering the question, what's the definition of loyalty? And if you start with share of category requirements, the percentage of purchases that I make within a category that I devote to your brand, that's a measurable number. Am I increasing that or decreasing that? Because if the loyalty program is working, I should have a significant fraction of customers where I am, to some degree or not, or the other, I'm able to increase the fraction of times they buy from us versus all the other times that they buy. And those are very measurable numbers. And the other thing is that there are, because in kind of default markets, all you need to know is a brand's market share, and you know exactly what that loyalty curve looks like.
Yeah.
And so there are ways that you can compare the average share of category requirements across all your customers versus your share of market. And there is a fixed relationship between the share of category requirements and your share of market. If that relationship deviates, it means that your loyalty program is working. And so again, that's a more difficult measurement to make, but it's very doable. I mean, there's lots and lots of people who are making these measurements individually. They're just not necessarily putting them together.
Hmm.
But the core still comes back to, does this program cause a significant fraction of your customers to choose you significantly more frequently than they used to?
Yeah.
And, if you use that as the criteria, what you see over and over again is that it just doesn't.
Hmm.
And even if you can get it to do that temporarily, like some massive economic discount based points program, your competitors will match you.
Yeah.
And so you might get a transient advantage, but you will not be able to get a permanent structural advantage in the market. And all you've done there is you now have just added an extra cost. You've added a program that is literally engineered to bleed off profits.
Yeah.
And
Sounds painful.
well, and to bleed profits off from your, your most valuable customers.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's take the people who, we're gonna get the most amount of revenue from. Just give them all money back.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time together. Before we wrap up, I want you to speak directly to that CX professional or marketing professional or loyalty manager who's been listening to this and feeling like they've been working towards, well, what might be a shaky foundation. Let's put it that way. They're probably feeling a mix of confusion, maybe some frustration as well, but also a curiosity. What would you like them to know? How are you going to send them off into the wild?
Well, I mean, again, there's no, law of the universe that says you couldn't get buyers to buy you more frequently. Um, so, there's nothing that says you can't come up with some sort of a program that works. Now, again, it will typically be a transitory win. You'll win for a short while, but even short wins are good. It's not gonna. It will never be a permanent structural advantage. But if you can string together a series of short wins, and especially given the fact that increasing the rate of purchase of brand selection will directly translate into increased market share, that has permanent value. So these are definitely things worth working for. And again, you see this in a company like Salesforce, where their product differentiation had such high economic value to a small cohort of buyers in the market that they were able to consistently take market share over a decade. Now, again, it also helped that their largest competitor was burning the house down at the same time. But it's a good example of how, and typically a product differentiation is going to be much more valuable and much more powerful than an economic discount. Again, going back to this idea of left-handed plumbers, if you're the only one who can sell an ambidextrous wrench to the left-handed plumbers, they're going to be highly loyal because you're going to give them something that they cannot get from anyone else, and you'll be able to deliver it at the same price. And so there are definitely ways of doing this, but it tends to be transitory. The second thing is start to become seriously critical of how the measurements are being done, because so much of what's driving the bad loyalty programs is completely corrupted measurement processes, where the measurement processes are engineered to always give you the quote right answer. The mere fact that there is no one out there who's ever heard the term share of category requirements should tell you something, because that is the gold standard. And that is not hard to measure. You can, especially if you have enough volume. So if you're in a consumer product category, you have enough volume, you can run purchase panels and you can see these effects directly in the purchase panels. So this is not something that requires, tools that are outside the normal tool set that you see, especially in the B2C world. B2B is a bit, B2B is a bit backwards anyway,
That's true.
but, uh, so the question is, choose measurement systems that are really going to answer that core question of, am I altering the rate at which people are choosing me versus someone else when they make a purchase? That's that share of category requirements. On the flip side, Because in the B2B world, since so much of B2B has shifted toward a subscription-based pricing, especially in things like SaaS, the flip of this is looking at your churn rates. And the same exact thing happens at churn, is that people who claim to be working on churn cherry pick completely corrupted mechanisms for measuring churn. And so the typical way that churn is measured is the fraction of active accounts that we lost this period.
Mhm.
Well, the problem is that fraction of active accounts is this mixture of people that just signed up, people who signed up a year ago, people who signed up 5 years ago. And if we're growing as a company, that means that we have a lot more people who signed up recently than signed up long ago, which means that um, that you're using that as a way to measure churn is guaranteed to make it look like your churn rate is a fraction of what it really is. And the correct way of doing this is what I call cohort-based survival analysis. And really serious companies, I mean, I was first exposed to this in the 90s, working with telecom customers, because really, really serious companies that are really serious about measuring their churn do not use churn rates the way people in SaaS do. They use cohort-based survival analysis, which means we look at when they became a customer and then what fraction of them are still with us after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 3 quarters, 4 quarters, 5 quarters. And what you see is within that cohort, you have this exponential decay curve.
Mhm.
And your churn rates tend to be extremely stable over time because that decay curve has a single parameter that measures your churn rate, which is half-life, customer half-life. And so what you'll see is uh, typically a really steep fall off during the onboarding period, and then a transition to a highly stable decay rate once you get past that initial, usually not more than 90-day onboarding period, once they've integrated the product into their workflow. And and what you'll see is the half-life might be 2 years, it might be 5 years, it might be 1 year, it might be 3 months. I've seen that too. But what that means is, if your half-life is a year, it means half the people that you had at the end of the onboarding period will be gone after 1 year. And then another half of those will be gone at the end of 2 years. So you're just cutting it down. And so if you're trying to alter churn, long-term churn, you have to measure it based on the customer half-life once they've gone through the onboarding period. And are you shifting the half-life? Can you turn that 1-year half-life into a 2-year half-life? Because if you can, you're going to see substantial retention and substantial additional revenue. But the deal is, I have seen companies where that half-life number didn't change, by more than a few percentage points over the span of 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Generally, the only way to fix that is to re-engineer the product, because people are either aging out of the product in some way, they're reaching some kind of a feature wall where they need the product to do something more. You see this with like Canva users. Canva is super easy for inexperienced people, but the moment you try to do certain things, you just hit a wall, and your only choice is then to jump to Photoshop and or maybe Figma. I mean, Figma is sort of an in-betweener, but a lot of the churn is driven by you know either people no longer need the product, or you've hit a feature wall where they've been forced to now move to a more sophisticated or more comprehensive product. And if you understand what's causing that, you can re-engineer the product and change the long-term churn rate. But you're not going to do it through marketing.
Nope. True. Well, I know this conversation might have been challenging. I know for me, it was challenging. I mean, you've taken us to question some of the most fundamental assumptions. That's never comfortable. It doesn't mean your work doesn't matter. It means your work matters too much to be based on unrealistic expectations, impossible goals, or theories that are just made up. It means we need to be honest about what is achievable so we can focus our efforts where they can actually make a difference. So thank you, Dale, to challenge conventional wisdom and for helping us to think more clearly about what customer experience and marketing and loyalty can and cannot achieve.
And
Thank you so
more realistic measurements. It really comes down because people get lulled into thinking, into fooling themselves that what they're doing is working because they're using measurement processes that are engineered to always tell them that it's working. That is really the heart of why a lot of this stuff, is simply continuing to be done, even though, there's abundant evidence that it just doesn't really work. That you really need to think hard about the measurement process and what it is you're actually trying to measure there.
Yeah.
And so I think that it really goes, the measurement problem goes to the heart of this.
We are going to go offline right now, and we're going to talk for a few more hours. But I want to thank the listeners to listening to or watching Table Stakes. If this conversation sparked something in you, whether agreement or disagreement or just curiosity, I would love to hear about it. Until next time, remember, the best strategies are built on truth, not wishful thinking. Thank you so much.